What happens when the King of the United Kingdom walks into the U.S. Congress, gets bipartisan applause, jokes about the Boston Tea Party, defends NATO, calls for peace, invokes faith, and subtly sends political messages to Washington, all in one speech? That is exactly what unfolded as King Charles III arrived in America for one of the most symbolically loaded royal visits in years. And behind the ceremony, the white-tie dinner, and the royal humor, there was something much bigger happening. A geopolitical message aimed at the United States, Europe, and the wider world. This was not just another ceremonial royal appearance. King Charles and Queen Camilla's visit to the United States came at a moment of major global tension. With war in Ukraine still unresolved, conflict involving Iran shaking the Middle East, debates over NATO intensifying, and questions growing over whether the West is becoming more inward-looking. In that context, Charles's address to Congress and the White House state dinner became something more than diplomatic pageantry. They became a test of the so-called special relationship between Britain and America, and a reminder that symbolism in geopolitics is never just symbolism. The first thing to understand is just how rare this moment was. King Charles became only the second British monarch to address a joint meeting of the U.S. Congress, following Queen Elizabeth II. That alone gave the event historic weight. But timing made it even more important. Charles was speaking to an America that is deeply polarized domestically and increasingly debated internationally over its role in the world. According to CNN and BBC coverage, he received a warm and notably bipartisan welcome, with frequent applause, laughter, and standing ovations. In other words, for a brief moment, a British monarch did something many elected politicians struggle to do in Washington. He united the room. At first glance, the speech sounded classic royal, warm, diplomatic, humorous, and full of history. Charles opened with wit, referenced Oscar Wilde, joked about parliamentary traditions, and even reassured Americans that he was not in the country as part of some cunning rearguard action, a line that played on the long shadow of the American Revolution. He also made Congress laugh with jokes about hostages at Buckingham Palace and Britain's historic role in America's past. According to Pakistani outlet The News, his humor dominated the speech and helped earn him multiple standing ovations. But beneath those laughs was a carefully calibrated diplomatic message. This is where the speech gets interesting. Charles wasn't just trying to entertain. He was using humor to create space for serious messages. One of the most memorable lines came when he teased President Trump by saying that if it were not for Britain, Americans might be speaking French. He also joked that the White House dinner was a significant improvement from the Boston Tea Party, a line that lightly touched one of the most famous breaks in Anglo-American history. On the surface, these were jokes. But politically, they served a purpose. They framed the U.S.-UK relationship as one that has survived conflict, rivalry, empire, revolution, and crisis, and still emerged stronger. That matters, because Charles's broader message was that the alliance must again prove its durability in a dangerous world. And this is where the speech turned unmistakably geopolitical. Charles stressed the importance of NATO and, according to BBC coverage, also reiterated the significance of AUKUS as part of deepening military and technological cooperation in an increasingly contested world. CNN's reporting noted that he also referenced the need to support Ukraine against Russia's unprovoked aggression. That is a major point, because it placed Charles, carefully and diplomatically, in defense of continued Western resolve at a time when American support for Ukraine has become more politically contested. He was essentially telling Congress and the White House that alliances are not relics of the past. They are the backbone of current global security. Perhaps the most consequential line in the broader reporting came from Charles's warning against becoming ever more inward-looking. That phrase, highlighted by AP reporting and OSV News, may end up being one of the most important lines of the entire visit. Why? Because it spoke directly to a central debate in both the U.S. and Europe. Should Western nations focus inward, reduce international commitments, and step back from costly security responsibilities? Charles's answer was clearly no. His framing was that Britain and America, despite their old divisions, built one of the most consequential alliances in modern history. and now have a duty to defend shared values rather than retreat from them. For a constitutional monarch who is expected to remain above direct politics, that was a meaningful message. Another striking part of the speech was the moral and spiritual language Charles chose to use. OSV News emphasized that he invoked the Christian faith as a firm anchor, spoke of Easter as a season of hope, and said he was praying that nations could stem the beating of plowshares into swords. That phrase matters because it flipped the traditional biblical imagery and underscored the fear that the modern world is moving away from peace and back toward militarization. He also spoke about compassion, interfaith understanding, and valuing people of all faiths and of none. This gave the speech an ethical framework that went beyond strategy and military alliances. Charles was not only arguing that the U.S. and UK should stand together because it is practical. He was arguing they should do so because it is morally necessary. One of the loudest reactions in the chamber reportedly came when Charles referred to the principle that executive power is subject to checks and balances. CNN noted that Congress erupted into applause at that point. That reaction is important because it shows how closely lawmakers were listening not just for historical references, but for constitutional meaning. Charles linked that principle back to English common law and the Magna Carta's influence on America's Bill of Rights. In other words, he was reminding Americans that some of the deepest foundations of U.S. democracy are tied to a constitutional tradition shared across the Atlantic. For supporters, it was a celebration of democratic inheritance. For critics of concentrated power, it also sounded like a subtle but unmistakable defense of institutional restraint. But diplomacy is often about omission as much as expression. CNN's analysis pointed out that Charles avoided going deeply into some of the most explosive issues surrounding the visit, including the broader U.S.-Israeli war with Iran and the scandal linked to Jeffrey Epstein. He made only limited reference to conflict in the Middle East, while focusing more heavily on peace, alliance, and shared values. That suggests the palace was trying to walk a narrow line, strong enough to send messages on NATO, Ukraine, and democratic principle, but careful enough not to trigger a direct diplomatic rupture with the White House. That balancing act may actually define the visit. Charles wanted to use the prestige of the monarchy to reinforce the alliance, not blow it up, even while hinting that the alliance requires moral seriousness and strategic steadiness. After Congress came the state dinner, and even there the symbolism continued. This was the first formal white-tie White House state dinner since 2007, adding a strong visual sense of prestige and historic continuity. President Trump praised the UK-US bond as a friendship unlike any other on Earth, while Charles used his toast to look backward and forward at the same time. He referenced Queen Elizabeth II's 1957 visit as a moment meant to put this special back into the relationship after a Middle East crisis, an especially loaded historical comparison given today's tensions. He also presented Trump with the bell from HMS Trump, a wartime submarine, as a symbol of shared history and what Buckingham Palace called renewal. It was theater, yes, but strategic theater. That bell from HMS Trump was more than a clever headline. It was a military object from a wartime submarine that served in the Pacific during World War II. By gifting it, Charles tied Trump personally to the long history of Anglo-American military cooperation. The message was subtle but sharp. This relationship was forged through common sacrifice, naval power, and war against tyranny. BBC reporting also noted that Charles linked the gift to the shining future of both countries. In other words, the past was being used to reinforce present alliance logic. At a time when NATO burden sharing, Ukraine aid, and global commitments are hotly debated, Charles chose a gift that said one thing very clearly: these countries have stood together before and should do so again. Publicly, the chemistry was warm. Trump praised Charles's speech, joked that the king had managed to get Democrats to stand up in a way he could not, and celebrated the long bond between the two countries. But reporting from CNN made clear that beneath the smiles were real tensions over Iran, over NATO rhetoric, over military policy, and over the broader direction of the alliance. That is what makes this visit so fascinating. It was both a celebration and a correction. Charles was honoring the special relationship while also quietly defending the values and institutions that give that relationship meaning. And perhaps that is the modern monarchy's role in geopolitics. Not direct power, but strategic symbolism deployed at the right moment. So what was this visit really about? On the surface, it was royal diplomacy, Congress, ceremony, humor, a state dinner, and polished speeches. But underneath, it was a message about the future of the West. King Charles used one of the most visible stages in American politics to defend alliance politics, support Ukraine, praise NATO, invoke shared democratic traditions, warn against isolationism, and call for peace in a world moving in the opposite direction. He did it with charm, with restraint, and with enough humor to keep the room with him. But the message was serious. History does not keep the U.S. and UK together automatically. That bond has to be renewed, defended, and defined again in every era. The real question now is whether Washington heard the message and whether this royal visit changes anything in practice. Was King Charles simply preserving tradition, or was he quietly warning America not to retreat from global leadership? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more sharp, global, and geopolitical breakdowns without the mainstream fluff, subscribe now, because the next big international story is already unfolding.